Michelle used to park 2 blocks away so her coworkers wouldn't see her husband's rusted truck. She told her sister he worked in maintenance, instead of saying his real title. For 12 years, Michelle was ashamed to be seen with the man she married. But the day 2 men in suits knocked on her door holding a folder with her husband's name on it, and a number with 6 zeros, she found out exactly who she'd been ashamed of. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Michelle ended up frozen in her own doorway that afternoon, you have to go back to the small brick house on Larkspur Avenue, where she grew up watching her mother measure every man in the neighborhood against the ones she saw on television. Michelle's mother, Carol, believed a woman's worth was reflected in the car parked in her driveway and the title printed on her husband's business card. Michelle absorbed that belief the way children absorb the things repeated at the dinner table every night, without question, without realizing how deeply it would shape the choices she made as an adult. By the time she met Anthony at a community college study group, she already carried a mental checklist of what a husband should look like. And Anthony, quiet and unassuming, did not check a single box on it. Anthony was unlike anyone Michelle had dated before him. He didn't speak about ambition in the way other young men did, chasing titles or salaries or the next promotion. He spoke instead about ideas, about how mechanical systems worked, about the elegance of a well-designed engine, or the way a small structural adjustment could save a family thousands of dollars over the years. Michelle found it charming at first, the way his mind moved through problems most people never noticed existed. He was studying mechanical engineering at the time, sharp enough that professors pulled him aside after lectures to discuss internships that most undergraduates never had the chance to touch. For a while, Michelle believed she had found a man who was clearly going somewhere. She had no idea how far he had already gone, or how much would eventually be taken from him before their story truly began. Everything shifted during Anthony's 3rd year of college, when one of his professors introduced him to a man named Gerald Whitfield, an investor who ran a small manufacturing consulting firm on the edge of town. Gerald took an interest in Anthony almost immediately, praising the sketches in his notebooks, encouraging him to document every idea he had, and promising that if any of them ever became something real, the two of them would build it together. Anthony, flattered and hungry to matter, showed Gerald everything he had. He showed him a fuel efficiency modification he had been quietly refining since high school, a redesign for small combustion engines that reduced fuel waste without requiring expensive replacement parts. Gerald called it brilliant. Gerald told him to trust him completely. Anthony, only 18 years old and desperate to be taken seriously, did exactly that without hesitation. 2 years later, Anthony sat in the audience of a regional manufacturing conference and watched Gerald Whitfield present that very design on stage as his own original invention. There was no dramatic confrontation, no lawsuit filed the next morning. Anthony was 20 years old, without a lawyer, without savings, and without any proof beyond a marked-up notebook that Gerald's team had conveniently never returned to him after their last meeting. Anthony spent nearly a year afterward quietly trying to get someone, anyone, to listen to his side of the story. Every door he knocked on somehow led back to people connected to Gerald's growing network of investors and manufacturers. Eventually, exhausted and humiliated, Anthony stopped knocking altogether. He withdrew from school before finishing his degree, took a steady job driving a sanitation route because it asked no questions about his past, and told almost no one what had truly happened to him. Michelle, who married Anthony 2 years after that painful chapter closed, knew only the faintest outline of the story, and even that outline faded further the longer they were together, replaced instead by a quiet, persistent embarrassment whenever she introduced her husband to new people. She would describe him vaguely as someone who worked in maintenance for the city, softening the truth just enough to avoid the questions she didn't want to answer. She told herself it wasn't dishonest, only simplified, the kind of small adjustment anyone might make to keep a conversation moving smoothly. She never stopped to consider what it might feel like for Anthony to overhear those small adjustments again and again, year after year, at dinner parties and family gatherings, where his real profession was treated like something to be managed rather than mentioned with any pride. What Michelle never knew was that Anthony had never actually stopped working on his original idea. Every night, long after she had gone to sleep, Anthony walked out to the detached garage behind their house, a space Michelle had stopped entering years earlier because it smelled faintly of oil and grease, and because, in her mind, It represented everything about their life she preferred other people not to see. Inside that garage sat a locked metal drawer built into an old workbench. And inside that drawer were 15 years of notebooks filled with calculations, failed prototypes, small breakthroughs, and the slow, patient reconstruction of the very idea Gerald Whitfield had taken from him. Anthony wasn't trying to prove anything to Michelle. He wasn't even trying to prove anything to Gerald anymore. He simply refused to let go of the one thing in his life that had always felt entirely, undeniably his own. The tension inside Michelle and Anthony's marriage never came from shouting matches, because Anthony rarely raised his voice about anything at all. It came instead from a long accumulation of small, quiet moments that Michelle repeatedly told herself didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. She skipped his 10-year work anniversary dinner because her regional manager was hosting an event on the same evening. She gently asked him not to attend her office holiday party the year her company brought in a new district director she desperately wanted to impress. She softened his job title at family gatherings, turning sanitation worker into vaguer phrases like, "He handles city infrastructure," whenever someone asked what he did for a living. Anthony noticed every single one of these moments. He never confronted her directly about any of them. He simply absorbed each one quietly, the same way he had absorbed the theft of his invention years earlier, and continued walking out to that garage each night after she had fallen asleep. Everything changed 3 weeks before the two men in suits arrived, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon at Carol's house, during the kind of family dinner Michelle had attended dozens of times without incident. Michelle's sister Kimberly had recently married a regional bank manager, and Carol spent most of the meal comparing the two households out loud, praising Kimberly's new kitchen renovation, her husband's recent promotion, and the vacation the couple had booked to the Bahamas for the fall. When the conversation eventually shifted toward Michelle and Anthony, Carol asked, in front of the entire table, whether Anthony had ever considered doing something more with his life. Michelle said nothing in response. She looked down at her plate, and for the first time in years, Anthony caught her eyes across the table and saw, unmistakably, that she agreed with her mother's question far more than she disagreed with it. Anthony didn't say a single word on the drive home that evening, and he remained silent for the rest of the night as well. Michelle, carrying her own quiet guilt, chose not to bring the moment up either, hoping it would simply fade the way so many uncomfortable dinners had faded before. But 2 days later, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street from their house, a dark gray sedan with two men sitting inside it for nearly 3 hours, before finally driving away without explanation. She saw the same car again the following evening, parked in almost the identical spot along the curb. When she asked Anthony about it directly, he told her not to worry, that it was probably nothing important, but something in the careful, measured way he said it left her more unsettled than reassured. That same week, Michelle overheard Anthony on the phone in the backyard, his voice unusually low and controlled, saying only a handful of words, before ending the call abruptly. "Yes," he said, "I still have every page of it." She didn't recognize the voice on the other end, and Anthony offered no explanation once he came back inside, changing the subject before she could ask a single follow-up question. Michelle began quietly turning over every possible explanation in her mind, each one darker than the last. She wondered if her husband had accumulated secret debt somewhere she hadn't discovered yet. She wondered if the strange sedan belonged to a collection agency, or worse, whether there was another woman somewhere in a story she still didn't understand. She started searching drawers around the house for answers, finding absolutely nothing, which somehow unsettled her even further than finding something might have. Eventually, Michelle worked up the nerve to ask Anthony directly what was happening, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, demanding an honest answer for once, instead of another deflection. Anthony told her only that it was old business, finally catching up, and asked her, gently but firmly, to give him a little more time before he explained the full picture. For a woman who had spent 12 years carefully managing other people's perceptions of her marriage, being kept in the dark about her own husband's life felt almost unbearable. That unbearable feeling was still sitting heavily in her chest 3 weeks later. On the exact afternoon, 2 men in suits knocked on her front door, holding a leather folder with her husband's name printed clearly across the top, along with a number she couldn't yet fully process. Michelle's hands trembled as she opened the front door that afternoon, and the taller of the 2 men introduced himself as Richard Coleman, an attorney representing a company called Ashford Industries, based 2 states away. He held out the leather folder and asked politely whether he and his colleague could come inside to speak with both her and her husband together. Anthony appeared in the hallway behind her before she could even respond, and for the first time in years, Michelle noticed an expression on his face she didn't immediately recognize, something closer to quiet relief than fear or panic. He invited both men into the living room, sat down across from them at the kitchen table, and gently asked Michelle to sit beside him as the conversation began. Richard Coleman opened the leather folder and slid a thick stack of documents across the table, along with several pages of detailed technical diagrams that meant nothing at all to Michelle, but visibly startled Anthony, who instantly recognized his own handwriting from more than a decade earlier staring back at him. Coleman explained that Ashford Industries had spent the last 8 months tracking down the original creator of a fuel efficiency modification that had recently surfaced in the middle of a licensing dispute involving Gerald Whitfield's company. Whitfield, it turned out, had attempted to sell exclusive rights to the design to a much larger manufacturing firm, but during the due diligence process, one of Ashford's senior engineers noticed inconsistencies between Whitfield's official patent filing and older prototype specifications that simply didn't match his documented timeline of invention. That single discrepancy had led Ashford's investigators back through more than 2 decades of paperwork, correspondence, and old conference records, eventually leading them to a name that appeared only briefly in the earliest documents: Anthony. Coleman explained that years earlier, Anthony had mailed himself a dated and notarized copy of his original notebook pages, a habit his old professor had once strongly encouraged in case he ever needed to prove ownership of an idea down the road. That single sealed envelope, postmarked 15 years earlier and left untouched in the back of a closet, turned out to be the deciding piece of evidence Ashford's legal team needed to confirm that Anthony, not Gerald Whitfield, was the true original creator of the design in question. Coleman went on to explain that Ashford Industries wanted to purchase the full rights to the invention directly from Anthony, effectively cutting Gerald Whitfield out of the picture entirely and avoiding a lengthy, damaging court battle. The company was prepared to offer a settlement worth $4,200,000, along with a formal senior position on their engineering team, if Anthony was interested in accepting it. For several long seconds, nobody in the room said a single word. Michelle stared at the number printed clearly across the top of the contract, then slowly looked over at her husband, the man she had spent 12 years quietly minimizing at family dinners and holiday parties, and realized, with a sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that she did not know him nearly as well as she had always assumed she did. Anthony finally spoke, his voice steadier and calmer than Michelle had ever heard it before, and he asked Coleman and his colleague for a private moment alone with his wife before signing anything. Once the 2 men stepped outside to wait beside their car, Anthony turned to Michelle and told her, for the very first time in their entire marriage, the complete story of what had happened when he was 20 years old, how Gerald Whitfield had taken everything he had built and left him with nothing but a single notebook and a difficult decision, to either fight publicly against a well-connected man or disappear quietly and rebuild his life from nothing. Michelle listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of 12 years of assumptions slowly beginning to shift beneath her. Michelle asked him, through tears she couldn't quite hold back, why he had never told her the whole truth sooner, and Anthony admitted that somewhere along the way, he had simply stopped believing it would change anything meaningful between them. He told her he had watched her flinch at the mention of his job title enough times over the years to convince himself that the deeper details of his past probably wouldn't matter to her either. He told her about the countless nights spent alone in the garage, not because he was hiding something shameful from her, but because that space had remained the only place where he still felt like the person he had been before Gerald Whitfield quietly stole that identity away from him. Michelle began to cry harder, not because of the number written on the contract, but because of what it revealed. She realized, sitting there at her own kitchen table, that for over a decade she had been quietly ashamed of a man who had rebuilt himself from nothing, entirely alone, without ever once asking her for the credit, the comfort, or the recognition she had never thought to offer him. She thought back to every dinner where she had softened his title, every holiday party she had asked him to skip, every time she had parked 2 blocks away just to avoid being seen beside his old truck. None of those moments had ever bothered Anthony enough to make him raise his voice or demand an apology. He had simply carried them quietly, the same way he had carried the theft of his invention, choosing patience and persistence over confrontation, night after night, for 15 consecutive years. The following weeks moved forward quickly once the initial shock began to settle. Anthony's newly hired attorney, recommended personally by Coleman, confirmed that the notarized documents from 15 years earlier were completely airtight and impossible to dispute in court. Gerald Whitfield's company, facing the very real possibility of a public fraud investigation and significant reputational damage, ultimately agreed to a quiet settlement rather than risk a courtroom battle that would expose the original theft to the public. Anthony never had to testify in front of a judge. He never had to relive the worst year of his young adult life in front of strangers or reporters. The entire deal closed within 6 weeks, and Anthony formally accepted Ashford Industries' offer to lead a small engineering division focused specifically on fuel efficiency design, the very field he had been forced out of as a powerless 20-year-old with no lawyer and no leverage of his own. Michelle stood proudly beside her husband at the official signing, no longer worried about who might see them together or what impression it might leave on coworkers or extended family members. Word of the settlement spread through the family faster than Michelle had anticipated it would. Carol called within just a few days, her tone suddenly noticeably warmer toward Anthony than it had ever been before, asking detailed questions about his new engineering position and mentioning, almost too casually, that she had always known deep down that he was a hard worker underneath everything. Kimberly sent a long, enthusiastic message congratulating the couple, quietly probing for specific details about the settlement amount between compliments. Michelle noticed the sudden shift immediately. The same family members who had spent years quietly overlooking Anthony at dinner tables, now eager to associate themselves closely with his unexpected success. For the first time in their marriage, Michelle found herself actively defending Anthony instead of staying quietly silent the way she always had before. She told her mother plainly, during a phone call that lasted far longer than she expected, that Anthony had always been exactly the same man he was now, patient, intelligent, and quietly determined, and that the only thing that had truly changed was who was finally paying attention to him. Carol grew unusually quiet on the other end of the line, clearly unprepared for her daughter to speak to her that directly about something she had spent years treating as an unspoken family joke. Michelle didn't apologize for the comment afterward, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel the need to soften anything for anyone else's comfort. In the months that followed, Michelle and Anthony's marriage settled into something neither of them had ever fully experienced together before. A kind of honesty built not from secrets uncovered by strangers in expensive suits, but from the difficult, overdue conversations they finally allowed themselves to have with each other afterward. Anthony kept the old workbench from the garage, carefully moving it into a proper workshop at their new home, not because he still needed it for his work, but because it represented 15 years of quiet persistence that nobody had witnessed until it was almost too late for Michelle to have witnessed it alongside him. He would often sit out there in the evenings, not working on anything in particular, simply enjoying the space without the weight of secrecy attached to it anymore. Michelle, for her part, stopped parking 2 blocks away from anything at all. She began openly telling coworkers, friends, and extended family members exactly what her husband did for a living, describing his new title with a quiet pride she had never allowed herself to feel before. When people asked follow-up questions about his background, she no longer deflected or softened the details the way she once had instinctively done. She told the full story, or at least as much of it as Anthony was comfortable sharing publicly, and watched people's reactions shift from polite indifference to genuine admiration almost every single time. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling for her, watching people respect her husband openly instead of quietly overlooking him the way her own family had done for over a decade. Anthony's relationship with Michelle's family changed slowly, and not entirely comfortably, in the months that followed. He accepted Carol's sudden warmth toward him politely, but with a noticeable distance that hadn't existed before, understanding clearly that it had taken a 6-figure settlement for her to finally see value in him. Kimberly invited the couple to more family gatherings than she ever had previously, and Anthony attended most of them for Michelle's sake, though he remained quietly guarded around people who had spent years treating him as an afterthought. He never brought up the years of exclusion directly, choosing instead to let his actions and his newfound confidence speak for themselves at every gathering he attended from that point forward. Looking back on everything that had happened, Michelle often found herself thinking about how close she had come to losing something valuable simply because she had been unwilling to look past surface-level appearances for over a decade of her adult life. She thought about all the nights Anthony had spent alone in that garage, quietly rebuilding something that had been unfairly stolen from him, without ever once asking her to understand or acknowledge what he was doing. She realized that his patience during those years hadn't been weakness, as she had quietly assumed for so long, but a deliberate, disciplined kind of strength that she had simply never taken the time to recognize or appreciate. That realization changed the way she viewed not just her husband, but the way she viewed quiet, unassuming people in general moving forward. Anthony, for his part, rarely spoke about Gerald Whitfield after the settlement was finalized, choosing instead to focus entirely on his new role at Ashford Industries and the engineering team he now led with quiet confidence. He occasionally mentioned, almost in passing, that he sometimes wondered what might have happened if he had fought publicly against Whitfield all those years earlier, instead of walking away quietly. But he never seemed to carry any lasting resentment about the choice he had made as a 20-year-old with no resources and no support system behind him. He simply seemed grateful that the truth had eventually found its way to the surface on its own, even if it had taken 15 long years of patient, unseen work in a garage most people had never bothered to look inside. Looking back, the hardest part of this entire story was never really the original theft, or the 15 years Anthony spent quietly rebuilding what had been unfairly taken from him without any recognition. It was the ordinary, everyday shame that Michelle carried for over a decade, the kind so many people quietly carry without ever fully realizing the true cost of it until the truth finally arrives, unannounced, at their own front door. We'll leave it to you to decide what you believe Michelle truly owed Anthony during those 12 difficult years, and whether $4 million was ever really the central point of this story to begin with. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if this story stayed with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one we bring you. Thank you so much for watching.